Welcome to Crisis in Perception. Our modern societies talk a lot about universal equality, but if you look closely, so much is still organized around things like inherited loyalties and group boundaries. So what's going on here? What is the system that we're refusing to see?
So to get into this, our guide is going to be Frank Salter's book on genetic interests. Now, I want to be really clear up front. This is a structural companion to its ideas. It's not a summary, and it's definitely not advice. We're here to understand the system it describes. And that system is built on the argument that humans have biological interests that go way beyond just themselves and their immediate families, extending out to wider populations with shared ancestry.
And Salter's work gets right into that tension, that gap between our modern, universalist language and the persistent, inherited loyalties that still drive so much human behavior. And that brings us right back to the central question for this explainer. What is the system we're refusing to see? To answer that, we're going to follow a 5-part arc. We'll start by identifying the unseen system and its core incentive. Then we'll look at the structural conflicts that result, ask why this code persists, and finally, see how it all interconnects with our modern institutions.
Okay, let's start by identifying this underlying operating code. What are we actually talking about here?
The core concept here is genetic interests. Now, this goes beyond just having children. It's the biological interest an organism has in the reproduction of its distinctive genes, which are shared not just with immediate family, but with wider kin groups, entire populations that share a common ancestry.
So this system emerges from 4 pieces that are all interacting. At the very bottom, you have evolutionary biology and kin selection, the basic principle that we favor relatives. This then scales up to what Salter calls ethnic continuity, the preservation of a wider kin group, or an ethne. And finally, this biological reality interacts with, and often clashes against, our modern political institutions.
So that's the system, but what's the incentive driving it? Let's explore the logic of this genetic investment.
This brings us to a really powerful metaphor. So we can think of our immediate family's genetic inheritance as a concentrated asset, right? Salter's framework suggests we can view an ethne, a population sharing common descent, as a distributed inheritance. It's the same fundamental genetic investment, just spread across a much, much wider group of kin. Salter's logic really follows from a direct question. If we all accept that parents have a vital interest in their children because of kinship, why would that logic just suddenly stop when the circle of kinship expands to the wider ethne? The argument is that the underlying principle stays exactly the same. So what happens when this deep-seated system of genetic interests collides with our modern institutions? Well, the result, Salter argues, is a series of predictable structural conflicts. When institutions don't account for these group attachments, structural stress points just inevitably emerge. We see this in intense political fights over demographic change, social conflict driven by mass migration, the rise of identity politics, and even strain on universalist welfare systems, which, let's face it, often started in more homogenous societies.
And the crucial point here isn't about some moral failure. It's about a structural vulnerability. When our institutions speak only in universal, individualistic terms, they often lack the very language needed to manage conflicts that are actually rooted in these unacknowledged collective interests.
This leads us to our 4th section. Why does this tension persist? Why hasn't this code just faded away in modern times? Well, here's the fundamental mismatch. On one side, you've got the official language of modern states, universalism, individual rights, abstract principles. On the other side, you have a human response that was shaped over much, much longer evolutionary timescales, a focus on inherited loyalties, group boundaries, and reproductive interests.
This huge gap, this space between our institutional language and our underlying human responses, that is what creates a crisis in perception. We struggle to see the real structure of the problem, let alone solve it, because our official vocabulary simply doesn't account for it.
So in our final section, let's connect this pretty abstract system to the very concrete world of policy and institutions. How does this biological reality scale up? It really works in steps. The core biological interest in kin and ethne doesn't just stay at the biological level. It shapes our powerful narratives of national identity. Those narratives, in turn, heavily influence concrete policies around migration and citizenship. And ultimately, these real-world pressures challenge the purely universal stories our institutions tell about themselves.
Salter references this famous quote from Edmund Burke to frame the state's role. The idea is that a nation isn't just a contract among the people who happen to be living right now. It's a partnership across generations. And from Salter's perspective, managing genetic continuity becomes one of the state's implicit long-term responsibilities in that contract.
And that leaves us with a final question. If this system of genetic interests is truly operating beneath the surface of our public discourse and our institutional narratives, then what does seeing that system clearly, what does achieving structural clarity actually require of us?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.